Hi, everyone. A little bit about myself. I have an interesting background. I started with engineering degree in biological systems at UC Davis. That's why I'm up here in Davis. And I was focusing on composting. And while I was at UC Davis, I lived in a community housing cooperative that had a lawn around it when I first moved in as a sophomore. And being the hippies that we were back in college, we sheet mulched the entire area and planted a food forest without knowing much about it. We just kind of read some books and planted things, um, and so I will send a picture of that later on. I couldn't pull up a picture. I was trying to look up a historical photo for you guys, but in a nutshell, I visited the site 10 years later, and you cannot see the house anymore. There's so many trees around it, and some things died and some things survived. And I took it as a lesson in what kinds of plants thrive here with neglect, because irrigation systems weren't repaired over the years, and so on. But now, I eventually went into a engineering program, working on research for the UC Davis biogas energy project, and then long story short, eventually got into a beekeeping project and started a beekeeping business when the bees were starting to decline. I thought that was a very big priority, and um, and I also, meanwhile, had worked on landscapes and gardens throughout my whole experience in Davis, including the UC Davis Student Farm, the Ecological Garden, and many gardens throughout town, including a garden I started near the domes called the Davis Bee Sanctuary, which is a permaculture demonstration food forest that feed bees and people, and demonstrates hugel culture. It's a gardening technique that hasn't really been uh, fully displayed in a long-term setting in this area. Um, and After having a kid on the way 5 years ago, I realized I should make a little bit more money and focus on a business. So I I started a landscape design construction company where I could actually full time do what I love, using permaculture, which is a design framework that uses principles learned from nature, from examples found in nature, principles that you can see throughout the natural world that have been tested, tried, and true for millions of years. And basically, people use these principles in a garden setting or a home setting for building homes and settlements, and um, building long-term communities, ecological sound with ecologically sound principles. And so, anyways, that was kind of in a nutshell. I have a eclectic background, and I kind of poured all my different interests into design, um, especially using permaculture and ecological principles. And so, with whole system designs, I've been doing that here in Davis for 5 to 6 years with my business partner and a small crew. And and with Sustainable Solano, I've kind of branched out into the more of the community educational work party style approach, which I really enjoy. Brings me back to my college days. So with that, I'd like to tell you what a food forest is in my experience. Um, so uh, the simplest definition of a food forest is is a garden that you design to have different layers of vertically stacked trees and shrubs and berries and bushes and perennials that cover the ground, ground covers and tubers and even fungi. And by carefully selecting plants, you can fit a lot more plants into a given space. And not only that, they will support each other if you do it in a proactive approach. So there is an emphasis on design up front, with a food forest if you want to have a lower maintenance approach. But if you if you are kind of like a hippie in college, like I was, without much knowledge, you can read some books and learn the key principles. And the main thing is you want to know what do you want to produce in your garden. I mean, that's the main emphasis, is what is the whole function of your garden. And there can be many functions. That could be a place to relax, a place to produce food, a place to provide food for the pollinators that visit your yard, hummingbirds, bees, native bees, honeybees. You know, they're even during a landscape project I was doing recently, I observed this type of wasp called a mud dauber, and I had a big trench for irrigation, and I noticed all these wasps coming. Nature will come if you provide what it needs, and not everyone wants mud daubers around, but I just saying, you know, as an example, nature will come if you provide little niches here and there. So food forest is a beautiful way to interact with nature, to use principles found in a forest, you know, using higher canopy and then lower canopy plants, understory plants, and even ground covers. And with all those niches filled, you will not have the niche of an open field of weeds, which, you know, people are constantly battling nature. The whole goal is to fill the void that nature will do if you don't do it yourself. So in a nutshell, that's how I would summarize a food forest. There's a lot to cover on it, but the important thing is have a vision of what do you want to produce: fruit, nuts, berries. What don't you want? Some people actually are allergic to bees. I'm a fan of planting for bees, but if you're allergic to bees, I would say a design constraint for you would be avoid some plants that are the favorites of bees. But in most cases, if you want to have a garden that's thriving, you need to support not just yourself, but also the local wildlife, and provide niches for them as well. So I don't know, Nicole, is that a good intro, or should I go on?
I think so. I think one of the questions that I received through email was the role of each of the 7 layers of the food forest. Mm-hmm. So if you could give like examples of like what role each of the layers plays, that would be helpful.
Okay, yes, that's a great question. That is probably one of the more important questions with the food forest. What's the whole point of the different layers? So I'll give the example of where I'm currently living. I've been renting at this place in downtown Davis for a couple years. What I really like about it is that when I moved in, there's this mature mulberry tree. And some people really don't like them because they produce a lot of leaf material and you have to clean up a lot. But for someone that likes to get out and get busy in the garden and interact, it created an opportunity not only to have a shady places to hang out and to shade my house, but also it provided microclimates where I could grow plants and not worry about them getting completely obliterated by afternoon sun, which is intense in our region. So, for example, I have a 5-year-old kid, and so he likes to interact in most areas of the garden because we do have this high canopy tree. But we also have enough sunlight where we can get away with a lot of different understory trees and plants. So I think of the mulberry as the canopy tree. It's the top layer. It's the highest tree, like in a forest, and it provides a microclimate. It buffers the weather underneath it so that things are less extreme. It does constrain you in that if you need full sunlight, you need to consider planting on a certain part of the garden that's not completely under it, but it gives you a lot of opportunities. in my garden, the next layer down is I have a plum tree. It's fully loaded right now, and um, it is partially shaded by this mulberry tree, but it does get enough sunlight. But it is the lower small tree layer of the food forest, so it's the next layer down. Um, it provides edible fruit that you can actually harvest, you can reach, unlike the tallest tree around. You know, like if I had an edible mulberry tree, a lot of that would just produce fruit that would fall on the ground. I might not get to eat it, but you know, wildlife would eat it. Um, but the smaller trees provide an easily harvestable zone. Um, and next down the list, I have an orange tree, a citrus tree, a little bit shorter, also harvestable. It is an evergreen, so it doesn't drop its leaves. It provides a lot of functionality in my garden in that it provides a hedge of privacy along the fence line, and it also provides a lot of fruit, and it provides a lot of fragrance for the garden when it's blooming, which I find actually an important function, that it helps bring you out to the garden. It's so nice to be there smelling the really nice flowers. Under that layer, right next to my citrus trees, I have the next layer down is the larger shrubs layer. And in my garden, I would consider the lemon verbena as the larger shrub, because I've trained it, trellised it to the point where it actually grows up to be about 8 feet tall. It extends beyond the fence line, and that is an excellent layer in the food forest, because there's so many options. A lot of different berries are in that zone, but there's interesting nitrogen fixing plants. There you don't need to get caught up too much in like what is what, like which layer is what. It's mostly a continuum from tall to below the ground. It's not like, because some plants people think, oh, that's an herb, or that's a shrub, or that's a perennial. But in my garden, the lemon verbena is around 8 feet tall, and then beneath that I have more herbs, culinary herbs. I have the rosemary, which is 4 feet, 5 feet tall, if you could prune it that big. And then going beneath that, there's the culinary sages and oregano and marjorams. You can get lower and lower, and all these things are fitting within a certain niche in the garden. And I don't have that incredibly large space, but I pack it all in there because of the vertical opportunities. In terms of one important function of the food forest is met by ground covers. You can easily mulch your garden. If you don't really want to plant ground covers, you want mulch to walk on, that's okay. You don't need to always plant ground covers, but ground covers will eliminate a lot of your need to mulch in the future if you plant things that will spread around and cover the ground, because you will get weeds if you have sunlight hitting exposed soil. So if you plant things that will fill in that niche, nature won't fill it for you with cleavers or whatever else likes to grow in that area. I think, what else did I miss out? Well, there are carrots. So my son is learning to garden, and he likes to seed things. An important thing with a food forest is that you can, as things are growing, it will change over time. It'll start off with more sunlight hitting the ground, so you can actually put in annual vegetables here and there, and then as you harvest them, the other plants around them, the perennials, will fill in the space. So over time, you may not have as much space for annuals, but in the beginning, it's an opportunity to stack in the time, not just in vertical space. So I would suggest considering some vegetables that you can easily seed, like beets, carrots, onions, that will fill in the niches along the ground. There are perennial vegetables. Not many people know that there are vegetables you can keep year after year without planting, which is a time saver and money saver, and just makes things a lot more enjoyable. One plant I really like that fills that kind of herbaceous layer in the food forest is it's called an Egyptian walking onion, and I find it thrives in our area. If you like onions, I would consider planting a couple of those here and there. They will basically produce a mini bulb on the very top. So you have the onion growing, and then you have a little bulb on top, and it kind of falls over because of the weight, and it plants another one. And so it literally walks. You know, it doesn't take over. It's not invasive, but it is very, you know, very fun plant to grow that produces a lot of edible onion greens. And then there are the root layer plants and the bioaccumulator plants that also are, you know, perennials slash herbaceous plants, and they include comfrey, for example. There are some varieties of comfrey that I would suggest. There's this one called the Bocking 14, I think is the number. It's got a weird name, Bocking 14. It's a variety that is less invasive. It won't spread seeds, and it won't take over if you like rototill or do something in the future. And those are plants, bioaccumulator plants. They have deep roots, and the idea is that their deep roots bring up nutrients to the surface in the form of, you know, abundant leaf matter that you can chop and drop. Chop and drop is a permaculture term for when you want to you literally mulch with the leaves of plants, and if you want to maintain these areas, herbs like to be cut back. It stimulates new growth. So you basically once in a while will harvest some comfrey leaves. You just cut them back, and then you spread it around, you know, your trees, and as a mulch. It's a free mulch, and those nutrients in the leaves become accessible on the surface where other roots are looking. And one other layer that people don't often talk about is you can actually grow edible mushrooms in your garden. In my backyard, in my shady backyard, and I suggest you do this if you have shade, because you won't have to water as much, and some mushrooms require more shade. You can grow Stropharia mushrooms, which are delicious mushrooms. They grow to the size of portobellos, if not larger, and you will be able to grow them on free wood chips, and you can plant into it. So you can actually do this in a raised bed with your veggies, or you can put it in a food forest with fruit trees, and it improves the soil. Worms love it. They'll come in, actually further break it down. So I would suggest considering a mushroom layer, edible mushrooms, if you're adventurous and you want to try that out. It is a beneficial thing for the soil, and also produces food. You can also grow other mushrooms like oysters and, things you buy in the store, but you can grow them in your yard. If you're irrigating your yard, you can irrigate the mushrooms too. I think the functions, though, the question was about functions. So all these have the functions of providing, covering the ground for weed control, or providing scents, or providing a hedge for privacy, or creating shade, or feeding the soil in terms of the fungi and the bioaccumulating plants. There's so many different functions. Some plants fulfill many functions. Those are my favorite kinds of plants, because you always have a use for them. They're not just looking pretty, but they're always, providing some benefit. And I also tend to like putting flowers here and there, even if they don't produce fruit or nuts or edible food for us. You can actually provide for hummingbirds and other wildlife, and it'll be a lot more enjoyable to immerse yourself and share the bounty. So Nicole, what's the next question?
Yeah, so let's actually, people can start raising their hands. If you go into the participants, there's a little place to raise your hand. So if you want to raise your hand, we have Elizabeth, so I'm going to unmute her and let her answer, let her ask her question. Takes a minute. Help, Allison, it's not letting me unmute her.
It does take a minute for the
oh, but
unmute
she
to work.
says she prefers to type.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll let you read then.
So she's not typing, she has a toddler running around, so we're gonna unmute Sandy. There we go, that worked.
Hi, Derek. I was, as you're talking about the different layers, I was on your website and I saw some of the designs that you've done. I see a lot of hardscape in different gardens that you've done. I'm just wondering what role hardscape plays in a permaculture garden, home garden.
Yeah, I can speak to that. Well, in a nutshell, running a landscape business, people always want hardscapes, at least in where I'm at. They always want paths, to lower maintenance pathways so that, you're not just walking on mulch or plants, but or grass. You have a long-term investment in paths that will actually attract you into the garden to take care of. It fulfills the function of getting you out there, and also, for the Pollinators Paradise garden we did in Dixon, they wanted a small patio so they could experience their front yard, which is now a food forest. So I feel like I don't know if that answers your question, but it's as simple as seating areas and pathways, and what's cool about that is when you design with permaculture, you always consider relative location. So there is a best place for your pathways, and and in my case, I don't tend to do straight lines because in nature you rarely see straight lines. There's obviously evidence of straight lines in nature, but most of the time you will see curvy patterns which create more edge, and edge is what nature uses for creating more abundant relationships and different niches for plants. It naturally happens that way. And so, for example, along pathways, you can plant a lot of herbs that you want to reach more often. A lot of my landscapes, they'll have some raised beds here and there, mostly in the full sun spots of the garden. And, you want to design your pathways to access things you use often. And maybe the things you don't visit as much, the farthest parts of your landscape or garden, if you have a sizable area, you might just use some stepping stones or nothing. You just walk on mulch. Walk on mulch is the lowest maintenance thing, and you can even plant ground covers to walk on. There are a lot of native sods also. There's native bunch grasses. There's culinary thymes that you can walk on, and I'm trying to think of some other ground covers, but I can share some more examples.
Are not, they're the swale, so it's just wood chips. So does that answer your question, Sandy?
I'm sorry, my screen just froze, so I missed a bit about the end, but don't worry about it. It's being recorded, so I can check that later.
So you didn't hear the whole thing, but a lot of times we don't put in hardscape. We're working around other people's hardscape that was already there.
Oh, okay.
So that's not really part of the scope of work for our projects.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's been some people that have repurposed things that they've already had for, pathways and stuff, but mostly it's repurposed items that they've already had.
Okay.
Could I add one thing to that? In Pollinators Paradise, we did put in some decomposed granite pathways, and you know, decomposed granite is you know, locally sourced, but it drains into the garden. It's permeable. So if you're going to do hardscaping, consider permeable options like mulch, or because that actually lets the water get into the landscape rather than create, you know, a drainage constraint. Or if you do put a hardscape that's not permeable, shed the water into your landscape. Design it in a way where it slopes into the landscape. That's all I'll say on that. I know it's not part of the focus of today.
Right, thanks, Sandy. All right, I don't have any other hands raised. Let's see.
Elizabeth typed in her question if you want to.
Can you read it?
Yep.
I don't see it.
So Elizabeth is wondering about swales filled with wood chips like she saw in the videos, and whether the wood chips would eventually break down, requiring some maintenance. So Derek, could you talk a little bit about the maintenance of wood chips in a swale?
Yeah, so the concept of backfilling your swale, which is basically a depression, you know, it's a lower part of your landscape to accept water. It can also function as a path. Some people call it a swath. You know, they just kind of combine the words, but you basically can fill it with mulch and it will decompose and it's full of compost, worms, worm castings, just all sorts of soil life. And I would say after a year, you will start seeing a good amount of compost at the base of that pile. And then where you get closer to the surface, you might have some more, like, it just looks a little more like fresh wood chips. So what I would suggest you do is just rake off the stuff that still looks like, you know, wood chips. Rake it off, reserve it, and then you can spread that around your pathways or put it back in your swale. But dig out the deep parts of it and use that as a seasonal compost that you can spread around your garden. You know, it's very it's free compost basically. It's not going to be extremely rich in nutrients unless you buried other things in the wood chips, because wood chips are only so, you know, they only contain so many nutrients, but it will be a fungi rich compost. And yeah, I would. And you know what I did once? I actually went a step further. Not only did I use it as a swale and a mulch path, I also inoculated that with oyster mushrooms in the last place I was living. And oyster mushrooms are the low-hanging fruit if you want to grow edible mushrooms. And I ended up getting tons of mushrooms. So once the mushrooms grew, I stopped using it as a dedicated path. And then I'd start harvesting it for you know, a few weeks. But yeah, it's a great concept, and it's very creative, and definitely serves many functions.
All right, I got a few questions here. How do you protect the plants from high wind? And that's from Stephanie. She's one of our food forest keepers in Rio Vista.
Okay, that's a good question. Most of the time, when I'm putting in a new landscape as a landscaper, I will stake trees, because it's an investment to get larger trees. Even shorter trees, you'll want to stake them so that as they grow, they develop a strong taproot, and they have a taper, but they're not like cracked in the, you know, random wind event. One thing that is an interesting concept with trees is there is a concept of tying it too tightly. If you tie it too tightly, like too rigid where it can't actually move, it just like, you know, it's tied around so tight it won't move, or it's just like strangled basically. The bark will start growing kind of, and it'll start strangling basically the girdling the stem. So that's one bad aspect of doing that, but also the tree needs to learn to sway a little bit so it actually learns to grow a strong trunk, and it should taper, get wider at the base, and then get narrower at the top. And it will only do that if you give it a little bit, like a few inches to play with when you stake it with the stake and some ties. But you know, people also are very creative when they have fence lines. you can grow trees, and if you're into pruning, you can grow a lot more trees placed closer together, and they can interlock. And there are fence designs, coppicing, and where they kind of go like this. And I'm doing a lot of sign language, but basically, I'll send a picture later. Coppicing is when actually that's not the right term. Coppicing is when you cut trees for the wood often. But what is the term? There's espalier is one style of basically training a tree, like a fruit tree, to grow like a fence, basically in one dimension along a wall. And you can train things to the wall. Some people use a hog wire panel and train vines up it. But yeah, I think in a nutshell, that's kind of, you just use stakes and you bamboo. If you have bamboo, I actually have bamboo growing from the neighbors. They had an invasive variety grown to the fence, and I just harvest it once in a while and use it as stakes.
All right. So let's see. We got someone that raised their hand. Ashley. Oops.
Hey, sorry. I think I kept trying to unmute myself at the same time as you. And so anyhow, thank you. So I moved into a home that had a food forest planted in it a few years ago. Very grateful to come into a yard that had been curated with such care and thought, and it's maturing and it's growing. And so now I'm starting to think about how to prune these fruit trees that are getting really big. And I have kind of a dumb question, but because you were talking about the Egyptian walking onion, and I was like, oh, that's what I ate last night. Like, I didn't know what it was. I just put it in a soup with some potatoes. But there's it looks like strawberries that were planted all in the top of, so there's the swale is the dip. What's the top of the hill called?
The berm?
The berm. So on the berm under the peach tree is what looks like strawberries, but they don't fruit at all. What is that?
Well, it could just be old strawberries, because strawberries usually, strawberry farmers, they dig up their old plants every year and put new ones because they produce a lot the first year. And so it could be a variety that was just planted so long ago, and now it's just a perennial. It's not actually very productive.
Oh,
but
okay.
there are ground covers that are different kinds of strawberry varieties that function as the ground cover, and some are shade tolerant, some like a lot more sun. But I'd have to see the picture or whatever to ID it.
Yeah.
But that's great that you have a food forest to move into. Did it come with a maintenance plan, or are you just kind of going in there like?
It came from a really amazing couple he walked me through the whole yard to talk to me about what he did, and he recommended a couple books. So it's just been a lot of research on my end. And I planted a pretty humongous vegetable garden in the sunny section, and I have a chicken coop. So I'm attending this Sustainable Solano is doing an event next week that I'm attending for chickens. But thank you for hosting this, because it's great to just hear you talk about the format and to understand a little bit more of the theory behind it.
Sure, thanks.
Nice to meet you, Ashley.
Finally.
She's Barley's Backyard. That's on our website, and it's in Benita. So yeah, you can check that one out on our website.
And she brought up an interesting point. So we talked about the 7 layers of the food forest, but also there are the chickens actually can fill a niche in a landscape, but you need to kind of contain them because they will basically kill most things unless you are very diligent and herd them around, only let them out once in a while, but you got to be careful. Jeff Lawton is a resource on all sorts of chicken tractors and all sorts of interesting ways to integrate them with. But he actually uses them as the first step. If you have chickens and you're clearing an area, you can use them to basically eat up all the weeds, fertilize the soil, and that's kind of like the first step towards maybe establishing a new area. I also have a beehive in my backyard under all these other layers. So I'm just trying to give you examples. You can fill in a lot of niches with you know, different strategies and elements. So thanks for bringing that up. The animal layer is another element aside from the human layer.
Okay, we're gonna go to the next question. This is Cynthia. Cynthia?
Hello. Yes. Is there such a thing as a organic herbicide? We have been fighting a battle with nutsedge in our front yard. We removed the lawn and sheet mulched and put in 9 fruit trees. We put in a bunch of pollinators and we're filling it in. So there's a lot of just mulched expanse. And this nutsedge has gone through layers of cardboard. We've hand pulled before we knew that there was a nut below. So I think we made the problem worse. But it just makes the yard look really messy. And, you know, we want our neighbors to like us. And so we don't want all this grassy stuff growing in the midst of, you know, our fledgling food forest in our front yard. So, you know, we don't want to get in there and poison things when we have all these fruit trees and all these pollinators and herbs and stuff in our front yard already. So we've been fighting nutsedge for weeks, months. So any suggestions for that? Because, you know, the way the yard looks is also really important since it's our front yard.
Yeah, well, you know, I will admit, nutsedge is one of the worst weeds to come across in terms of it just wanting to keep coming up. And so, you know, and your question initially was, are there organic herbicides? And yes, there are organic herbicides. There actually is a product I've been experimenting with just for this kind of a purpose, but I'm not sure if it nutsedge is. I haven't verified because I don't deal with that too much in Davis. But it is called, look up organic corn gluten herbicide, and you will find like 25-pound bags of this product. It's basically organic corn that is ground up, and you sprinkle it around your landscape, and it actually, you can sprinkle it on lawns as well. And I'm not an expert on lawns, but the claims and the feedback on it is basically it fertilizes, it's a fertilizer, but it changes the chemistry of the soil to the point where seeds don't germinate. And that's the concept. It takes consistent use though. So you have to use it seasonally to get up to 90% to 95% reduction in the recurring seeding. I don't know if it's good for nutsedge, but it's kind of, and I'm not a salesperson for this product and I don't have long-term experience, but you could look up the feedback on these products when you look up online the sources, like, you know, you can get it through various stores. And I don't want to advertise any of those big stores right now, but yeah, there does exist that. And if you're going to seed things you want, it's going to not let those germinate. So it's kind of like, you got to say, is this a perennial landscape? You can plant rooted plants into the ground. It doesn't affect them. It fertilizes them. But in terms of the permaculture approach, I don't normally like say, oh, let's get dependent on an input. What I would say is focus on the plant. What are plants that look good, that are thriving in your yard, that kind of cover up the nutsedge? Because higher shrub layers, basically, that might shade out the ground more. Because I think nutsedge is going to grow more if you have more exposed soil. And I think you can get away with more of a shrub layer, if vigorous shrub layer, basically. And I don't want to get into details on like exactly what plants, because it just depends on your setting. But yeah, I think that's what I would say. Sorry, I'm not an expert on nutsedge, but I feel for you.
Also, do you have recommendations for a smart water controller? Because we just have the old-fashioned Rainbird controller, And someone just told me that there are a bunch of different smart ones.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so I'm super interested.
Yeah, so I have experience installing the Rainbird smart meters as well as the Rachio, Rachio, and that one I just installed the other day for one of my clients, and they absolutely love it. And they kind of geeked out. They went on a trip over the weekend, and then I called them and like, turn on your irrigation. And they were like, oh yeah, and they went on there and they were saying how smart it was, like all the different, questions it asked so that you can set it up. They do cost more, but you start seeing them more and more. They actually started getting more popular a year or two ago, and actually I think they're required by the state for like new landscapers to install. So I've been starting to install them for most of my clients. But I don't think you need to rely on that. It's just if you have a lot of zones and you just want to you're into that kind of high tech stuff, that is a fun thing. And they used to have, with the Rachio, they used to have the flow meter that goes along with it, and they stopped selling it for some reason. The whole idea with that was you can link a flow meter to your timer, your controller, and it will tell you if there's a leak. And then it will turn off your system if there's a leak and alert your phone. Because all these smart meters, you can use your phone to turn them on and off. And so I would just shop around and look for maybe ones that feature like leak detection, because I think that'll save you thousands of gallons of water. If you're not paying attention, it will tell you.
Thanks, Cynthia. All right. Okay, the next one will be Heather. Heather?
Hi, I actually typed my question in, but I can ask it out loud. What kind of a resource could I get to that might be willing to loan me bees without me being the owner of the beehive or keeping the beehive? Are there resources out there where I'm an ag science teacher at a school, and so I can't necessarily own the hive, but I would love to house a hive. Is there a resource for that?
Where are you located? Do you know where you're located?
Oops, she muted. Let me unmute. Uh-oh.
I'm located in Fairfield.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't know an answer for Fairfield, but you might have a beekeeping association that they would know. So I would look up Fairfield Bee Association, or just look up Bees Fairfield. You should find whoever. Davis has a wiki, so all the beekeepers post on there, and then when people have bees moving into their house, they're like, they call the numbers listed. But we actually in Davis, we have a new nonprofit called Circle of Bees, and I used to have a beekeeping business, and I was kind of known as the bee guy, and I'd catch all the swarms and help people get bees. And when I got busy with my landscaping career, my friend who used to do swarm captures with me, he started a nonprofit called Circle of Bees. And so if you want to look into the circleofbees.com or it's kind of an idea that maybe someone in your community would pick up. Some beekeepers might host a hive in your yard, but the idea is, people host a hive, they learn about the bees, they share the space, they maybe plant some flowers for them, and then the beekeeper comes and checks on them and makes sure they have what they need, which isn't much because they harvest everything themselves. The idea is you take care of them, you don't rob them of all their honey, which the big beekeepers tend to do.
Got it. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Heather. All right, Stephanie. Oops.
I saw a question on the chat I'd love to cover right now. It's a very quick one.
Okay, then Stephanie, then you're muted and you can answer after this one.
So someone asked about books. Who asked about books? I just saw it, and I meant to show you. This is a book. Can you all read that? Edible. Okay. So this is Dave Jakey with Eric Townsmeyer. These names, look them up if you want to look at local, like the latest on food forest design and really cool list of books or plants that you can use based on your region. I also had a resource. I want to share something on my computer screen. I pulled in this. I'm going to share this. Tell me if you can see this. Can everyone see this?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is an amazing resource, and I'll make sure it gets out to everyone. It's a global inventory of perennial vegetables. So these are plants that will live more than 1 year that provide food and different functions. And so when you see this, when I send it to you, I would go to the Mediterranean section, because that is the climate that most represents our region, and at least the people I think who are on this call in Solano area. And you guys gotta go down to the Mediterranean, and you will notice the Mediterranean region is the largest section of plants on here. It's got so many different, let's see, where to go? There it is. So you can see it sideways, sorry about that, but you can see the walking onion on there, and got chives and asparagus. Asparagus is a perennial vegetable. It's the one most people are aware of. There's different types of kale, like perennial kales, that a lot of different kinds. There's tree collars. There's, but if you can just go through this and learn about some of these plants, and then look them up individually and make sure they actually fit your USDA zone, just to be sure. And some stuff you just can't get, in your area yet. But as more and more people garden, nasturtiums, that's something that I have that provides edible flowers and leaves. Goji berries, and anyways, that's a little bit of a tangent, but I will share more on that later. Let's see.
Yeah, that's a great resource. I'll email that to, once you send me the link, I'll email that to everybody.
2 books I have here. Garden. In a nutshell. One of my teachers, Toby Hemingway, this latest book's called The Permaculture City. It's kind of more theoretical. It's less of the garden focus, but it covers how permaculture applies to your life in general. This is the Bible of permaculture, written by the founder of permaculture. So what's the question?
Okay, Stephanie. Hi, Stephanie. So Stephanie's one of our food forest keepers in Rio Vista.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Go ahead.
Okay. I was kind of excited about you when you started talking so much about mushrooms. This spring, a whole bunch of mushrooms came up in my new installation on the wood chips, but I was afraid of them because I had no idea what they were. But I've started playing around with trying to grow oyster mushrooms in coffee grounds. And anyway, I would like to get more information about how to grow mushrooms somewhere in our layers.
Yeah. So a good resource is this company called Fungi Perfecti, and I will advertise for them because they have a mission in their company to save the bees. They donate a lot to the bees. So I direct people to them. Paul Stamets. If you want to get blown away and have hope for the world, look at Paul Stamets' research with mushrooms and all its applications in terms of healthcare and saving the bees and medicinal and edible uses. But I guess in terms of growing mushrooms, the first thing you should learn is not to just start harvesting anything growing. Don't trust anyone that says it's an edible mushroom until, unless it's a mushroom or mycologist. So don't trust me, won't say I say, just assume it's all poisonous. That's the starting point. But that said, oyster mushrooms don't have a poisonous lookalike. So that's why it's a good low-hanging fruit. If you want to grow, and they also grow on wood chips and logs and straw. You can grow them in straw in your veggie beds, like, and just water the mushrooms in the straw while you water your garden. Yeah, so fungi perfecti and Paul Stamets are good resources. And
could you write those names down in the chat, or somebody write it down for you so I can copy them? And
yeah, I'll write it right now. Yeah. Okay. I think that, I don't know if that got sent, but
And you know what, we can, a lot of times what we do is get all the resources that Derek is giving us, and we'll send an email to everybody with it in there.
thank you.
Yeah. Anything else, Stephanie?
This is all very new to me, and I could, you know, just take over with asking questions. But a lot of the stuff that came up, I don't know how to use it very well. And so I would kind of like to learn more about harvesting, how to maintain the plants, and how to when and how to harvest them. Like the borage came up, and then they were beautiful, and then they got big and unwieldy and kind of fell over. And there might have been a point in there before them falling over and rotting on the ground where I might have done something cool with them, but I didn't know.
you might have done something cool with them. I'm sorry, I didn't.
Yeah, I just didn't know at what point that I could harvest the particular plants so that they, you know, that they're useful to me instead of just being pretty hanging out in the back until they're finished what they're doing.
Well, that's like a lifelong process, I think, within the garden. Like borage, you can eat the flowers, you know, you can, like that's, I mean, that's the only thing I've ever done with borage is just put it in salads. But usually when they're blue and opened up. But yeah, I think it's going to be a lifelong process of learning what.
Yeah, I have so much to learn.
Yeah,
you got a whole kingdom of plants out there just waiting for you to learn about them. You did bring up one kind of niche that I didn't really talk about was, I mentioned annuals. You can plant annuals in your garden. Well, there are flowers like calendula and nasturtiums and borage that will do. If you plant it once in your garden, you seed it sometime, they'll just keep coming up when there's an open gap. And then you can actually just liberally cut them back if they're taking over an area, or you know, harvest them and cut them back at the same time. But they do fill in niches nicely instead of having some weed grow. So that's kind of a cool, you just have to be careful. You know, I wouldn't like seed stingy nettles everywhere, for example, for obvious reasons. But, you know, just read up on each plant. There's so much wealth of knowledge online, you know, you can read up on everything, and just start with one plant, you know, get a connection with one plant, use it every day, make tea with it if it's an herb. Yeah, read up first before you plant things too, because then you don't have to deal with invasive issues if it's some kind of plant that takes over.
Thanks, Stephanie.
So thank you.
All right, we've got Courtney. Courtney?
Oh, hello. Thank you so much for this. It's very fascinating and exciting. My partner and I are going to move into and rent my grandma's place in a few months, and she has a really large backyard in the Sunset District. Right now, it's like sand covered by plastic. And so we want to do something like a sustainable food forest, but it's also really intimidating because we're total beginners. And so I just don't know, like, what is step one and what is step two of trying to go from this really like neglected.
Well, I could tell you step one if step one, even though usually I would say it depends on your situation, but in this case you have plastic with sand on it. I'd take out the plastic. It might be a lot of work, but it's well worth it, because your soil will never improve with that plastic layer on it. It will only get worse, and you'll have weeds growing on the top of it. So I always tell people, don't use landscape fabric, don't use weed fabric, because actually, from my observation and experience, you will always get weeds on the surface of that. If you mulch on top of it or put rocks on top of it, just avoid that, because pulling weeds out of plastic and dirt is harder than pulling weeds out of the ground in a nice fertile soil. So start with your soil, start removing the plastic and I don't know about the sand. I'm not sure exactly why that's there, but you might reserve it.
I think it's because it's in the sunset. It's like near the ocean.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I should have asked where you are.
Yeah.
Yeah, some people just have sandy soil. And some plants like sandy soil. So with good drainage. So plants that require good drainage, you will get away with it more likely than someone with a heavy clay like I have.
Okay.
Yeah, so I would start with the removing the plastic, but then start adding organic matter to your soil and covering it with, sheet mulching. Look into the videos that Solano County made and or Sustainable Solano, and we cover sheet mulching and talk about its benefits and show how to do it. It's pretty good.
Okay, thank you. This is so cool.
Yeah, thanks, Courtney.
Yeah, good luck on your journey. It gets more fun. The first tomato you grow or the first herb you harvest, it's just get to that point, and then it'll become an addiction that will benefit you and others.
Thank you.
And in a minute here, I'm going to be posting a link to take our survey, and this really will help to inform kind of what classes we select. It lets the funder know that you guys are interested in this type of stuff. So I'm going to put it in right now. Let's see. 1 minute. There we go. There we go. All right, it's in there. All right, is there any other questions for people raising their hand? It's tricky, and I apologize. I'm not a great multitasker, and I have a hard time following the questions in the chat. So if there's any more pressing questions that someone has, please raise your hand and we'll get to them. And then we also had a few other questions that were emailed to me, so let's go ahead and ask those. So have you heard of any complaints of people receiving bug-infested mulch from companies that cut trees?
I haven't, but you're going to get bugs in any mulch, especially if it's been sitting around for a while, because that's the soil decomposition process. You get first you get the bacteria and the fungi and the molds, and then you'll get and by the way, if you're going to get an arborist to drop off mulch for you, make sure you ask them when you're ready for the delivery. You have a tarp ready to go if it's going to go on a driveway. You have you're ready in the landscape for that mulch, because you don't want it sitting around getting moldy. It will eventually get moldy after even just a week. It might. You want to spread that out quickly so it starts having a thinner layer. Like 2 to 4 inches is kind of the sweet spot for mulching a garden and a food forest. Try not to go on a tangent on mulch, but that's,
You answered 2 of the questions. And so then there's another question about cherry trees, that my cherry tree gave a lot of cherries last year, but not much this year. Did I not water enough? Do some fruit trees alternate between big bounty and mediocre bounty each year?
Yeah. It's called a mast year, or masting, I believe. It's when a fruit tree, for example, or an oak tree with its acorns, each tree has its own biological cycles. And for example, an oak tree, I believe it takes 7 years for it to reach another mast year, and it will just keep dumping acorns. It's like incredible. And I've seen that in Davis twice since I've moved here, since 2004. So kind of fits that timeline. But fruit trees also will produce a lot more. I have a lot more plums this year than I had the last few years. And there's a lot of variables, but yeah, one of them is that trees actually will out of your hands. They will do their own cycles. So, but you can, it's a whole nother tangent, is fruit tree maintenance and care and pruning. And so, you know, winter and summer pruning. I know this is a question someone had in the got sent out earlier. And, you know, winter pruning helps with developing the structure of the tree. And you'll do that in like January, February, March, early March. And you got to be careful not to do it when it's a rain, you know, event, or, you know, rain is going to happen. You want it to have dry weather, but still be cold and the tree doesn't have leaves. So deciduous fruit trees like, you know, like apples and plums and, you know, all the stone fruits, you do a winter pruning, but each tree is different. Even apricots, there's a specific, it's a pest, or no, it's a fungus that actually you don't want to prune apricots in the winter. You want to do it in the summer. So there are specific requirements by each tree if you want to maximize fruit production. Summertime, I tend to prune in summer to reduce the mass of the biomass and kind of get the tree smaller. Winter pruning is more for like stimulating growth, choosing those structural branches and stimulating where you want the branches to grow. Like you can train trees to grow kind of wide and harvestable instead of just getting out of control. And then summer, you know, if you prune in the summer, the roots will kind of balance out. They'll die off in relation to how much of the stems and branches you remove. In the winter, if you remove a ton of like branches, the problem is that the roots won't really die in proportion because it's kind of the dormant season. And so when it comes time for springtime, if you had pruned so much branches, it's going to just grow like crazy. And that might be a little excessive and out of control. So I would read up on fruit tree maintenance and care for your specific kind, and you will be able to maximize fruit production. And then there's the mass years, which you can't really control.
That was thorough, but there's so much to fruit tree pruning. And again, if you guys take that survey, put your suggestions of future classes, things you want to learn about. We have done pruning workshops, but typically they're done at a food forest live in person. So we might try to do one via Zoom, just so more people can access it. So then
I do want to make one other point, Nicole. So fruit trees, there is this fruit expert in Arizona, and I can't remember the name of it, but I'll send it out in the notes. He specializes in different compost blends, and he actually has a blend he's come up with for stimulating maximal fruit production. So it's kind of an interesting idea. I haven't explored it too much, but if you're like going for the, you know, like advanced degree in food forests or whatever, you can actually stimulate plants from the soil to produce more fruit. That's just advanced though. Don't get too crazy with that. Just add fertility to the soil with mulch and compost, and you're doing a lot better than most people.
And Allison just put some of the resources from the fruit tree workshop that we had in the chat. So there's, if you're interested, that there's some resources there. And then the last question, this was the last question from Brenda, and she's one of our food forest keepers in Fairfield. The name of her food forest is Mom's Delight. And her last question is, any ideas for keeping neighborhood cats from using the yard as their litter box? I put down chicken wire, but trip on it if not careful, and I planted mint and oregano in some places.
Yeah, I would say don't plant catmint or catnip. That's the first thing I would say. I don't know if there's a silver bullet with the you know, keeping cats out of a yard. They just love it. You know, they love food forests. They love going around, and it's just nature to them. I mean, they're wild cat. They, you know, they're ancestors or whatever. What am I saying? I'm no cat expert, but I have the issue. Don't leave a sandbox out open with the open lid. That never happened to me. And I do see there's some products and like enzymes that people, natural enzymes. It's always, you got to research that stuff, but people spray in the garden and it's supposed to repel cats and not kill things. I don't know if that stuff works.
A few there's been a few in the chat. Pine cones layered in your beds and lay down blackberry prunings.
Oh yeah, make it less comfortable.
Yeah.
That's true.
And I've put sticks up to keep squirrels and stuff out, and that seems to have worked. But yeah, keep trying different stuff. Let's see, is there any other questions?
A couple more raised hands.
Oh, we do have a raised hand. I'm sorry, I was reading. All right, Sledgy, I'm gonna unmute you. Hello?
Hi, Slaggy, yeah.
Slaggy, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. It's that's how my email is. But what I've seen in my cherry trees and my apricot trees, as far as the fruiting that does not come, it's because the rains came and knocked the petals off, and therefore we did not get the amount of fruit according to how much rain we got. And that's what I've seen when we get those later rains in the year, we don't get the fruit because it knocks off the petals. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, you'll get the random weather events that kind of jeopardize all the things you do, and you can't help it unless, there's also the hard frost, like with fruit trees, like citrus. Most of them can handle cold weather, but if you get a hard frost, some people use a blanket and cover them and put Christmas lights up. So there's ways to kind of mitigate random things like that. But rain is like a tough one because, what are you going to do? Cover your whole tree just when it's raining? Yeah, that's a good point.
You get what you get, and plant a whole bunch of trees in different spots.
Yeah, and can I make a point about cherries? So when I moved to Davis, cherries were amazing. They were one of my favorite fruit. And then I forget what year it was. It's been a while, like maybe 8 years or so. A new pest came in. Basically, it gets into all the cherries for the most part, unless you're treating them, and it just spoils them. They look great, but then you go to bite it, and it's fermented and has disgusting, insects. I guess it's got insect poop or something in it, but. Yeah, so I don't actually recommend cherries for that reason, because they become more of a higher maintenance thing. So you could plant trees that don't have so many pests, and you will have more luck. So like if you're starting a new garden, you're not new to all this, I would choose things. Citrus is pretty bomb proof is what they say, and pineapple guavas, they are so hardy, and pomegranates and figs there's some plants that are just so hardy in our area. If you like those things, start with the hardy things, and less pests will come, and you won't have to deal with spraying and all this stuff people go out of control with, in the monoculture.
Nicole, you're muted.
Leggy.
I'm sorry, I was talking. Thanks, Leggy. The next question is Carla. Let me unmute her. Sometimes I don't know why. Sometimes it takes a minute. Oh. All right, Carla, I think we got you.
Hello, I posted my question in the chat. Is there a local mycologist who can come and look at our mushrooms and tell us whether they're safe or not?
Oh.
I don't know. Where do you live?
I'm in Vacaville.
I'll think about it if I know anyone in that area. I don't know any like mushroom experts in your area though, on the top of my head. But UC Davis had some good mushroom guys. Funny thing, I ran into one of the old mycology professors I envied in college. I always wanted to take his class, but I couldn't because I had other engineering classes. And he retired, and so I ran into him one day. catching a swarm of bees. He's a beekeeper too, so he's part of the beekeeper community. So you might, if you know beekeepers, you might know some mushroom people.
Okay.
And Carla's one of our food forest keepers in Vacaville, and she did also wanted to put out a question to some of the food forest keepers of how to entice people to harvest in her yard. So I know one of our oh, Kimber, I see you. All right, let's unmute you.
Who was the question from?
That was from Carla. So she was one of our food forest keepers, and
she has an abundance she wants to share.
She wants to share, and so any ideas to get people?
So can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Hi.
Okay. So I'm a Rotarian, and one of the things that I'm a lead on is us gleaning from houses and things that have an abundance of produce. We're coming out and we're gleaning and donating it to the food bank and Meals on Wheels and the such. So you can always email me and I'll get a team together to come on, usually on the weekends. So if you email kimbersmith2010@gmail, I'll put it in the chat, and I'll make arrangements to pick.
And what zone are you, what region are you?
Vacaville, yeah, Vacaville, Fairfield for the most part. Maybe a little Vallejo, yeah.
Thank you.
We even get to Dixon.
Thanks, Kimber. Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And another one of the things our food forest keepers does is she has the food is free stand outside of her house in Benicia, and she puts all her excess produce, and now it's become where people are bringing produce all over the place. It's now kind of a real resource site. So it's food is free, and it's you can look that up. Yeah.
Yeah, and your neighbors might, you might meet might be a good icebreaker with neighbors too. You don't have enough for a gleaning crew to come out, maybe you just share some with your neighbors, and maybe they'll share something in return later on you don't even know they had.
Yep. All right. Thanks, Kimber. Reach it now. All right. Is there any other questions? If you can raise your hand, that will be helpful. And if Laura raised her hand. Let's see. Maybe she did it. Oh wait, there you are. Okay. Sorry, you guys, I'm not great at this. No, I'm unmuting you. I think maybe people are trying to unmute themselves.
Yeah, it's probably good for folks to know that Nicole is the one who can unmute you. So if you try to hit the button, all you're going to end up doing is muting yourself. So
yeah, for some reason I can't. And then some people I can't unmute. So
do you want me to try?
Yeah,
I see Laura and Elizabeth. So Laura,
I can unmute someone. You want me to unmute Laura?
Yeah, okay. Laura's unmuted.
Mine had a box to say you were trying to unmute me. Did I want you to or not?
Oh.
So that's what popped up on mine. I'm new to all of this. So I'm one of the new food forests here in Fairfield. And last year, my garden just exploded. I had so many fruits and vegetables. A lot of the neighbors are out walking, and I just invited them in and would give them like bags of tomatoes or bags of lemon cucumbers. And it was really interesting how people would then knock on my door to say, can we take some more? And I go, yeah, definitely take whatever you want. So whoever walked by, I talked to and invited them into the garden and showed them what was there. And they were just eating like the cherry tomatoes right off the vine. So yeah, just continue to talk to your neighbors, and they really appreciate it. And as they get used to you saying, come take what you want, they do. It's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
So hopefully that helps who was ever
Thanks, Laura.
wondering how to do it. So
thanks, Laura.
Yeah, thank you.
That's great. And Elizabeth, I forgot about the toddler running around. So she has put the question in the chat. And Nicole, do you want to read that?
I can see that one, yeah.
Yeah.
I saw, I think in the videos that you were planting trees with non-native soil in the hole. If I'm wrong, disregard this. I was under the impression that the current recommendations for tree planting are not to amend the soil because the trees will contain themselves to that hole. Do you have a preferred tree planting method?
Yeah, that's a good question, and yeah, you kind of caught us. There is consensus getting reached on, most like, for example, native plants, you definitely don't want to amend the soil at all. But with fruit trees, if you are going to amend the soil, do a very small amount. I mean, the focus should be distributing the compost over the whole area of your garden, because the roots will, and the soil life will be more distributed, and the roots will grow out to access it. You don't want all the fertility in your planting hole. So yeah, I think that's a good thing you brought up. You don't necessarily have to amend the soil, but if it's really heavy clay, it might help to sprinkle in a little compost. It might help retain some of that moisture and add a little bit of soil life to the planting hole, but do it very sparingly, like less than a quarter of the hole at the most would be backfilled with some kind of compost blend, or none. You might be better off just not doing it at all. Everything depends though on your circumstances, your soil, and so forth. So just kind of take that with a grain of salt.
And there was another question in the chat from Dave Avery. He's the one that did the video, that recorded the video. What are your favorite low water use vines for screens, heat reduction, fruits, beauty, etc.? So your favorite low water, yeah, that's
my favorite low water vines that. Sorry, I kind of lost on all the other
your
things.
Your favorite low water use vines for screens, heat reduction, fruits, beauty, etc. Favorite low water use vines. I mean, I know that passion flowers, I have had success with that.
Yeah, and you have you noticed the fritillary butterflies coming to your passion?
They're beautiful. It's right out here, and it's now shading. So the summertime, I kind of keep it so it shades. My window. So yeah, it's a good
so the thing with vigorous growing vines is that they will require more maintenance. So most people don't want to do the maintenance. They want something simple. But if you are willing to prune a couple times in the summer in the growing year, things like things like passion fruit, that's a great idea. There are thornless blackberries, which are becoming more common. There's some varieties that don't even need to be trellised if you're willing for them to kind of grow out a little bit. But if you do want them to, be easy to harvest, you can train them onto a fence line with some hog wire or just some string or stakes. You can be creative. The idea is that you are guiding its growth wherever you want with whatever resources you have. And if you have an aesthetic for that, that's, maybe you invest some more resources into a long-term trellis. In terms of other vines, let's think about that. Grapes are super vigorous, and over time they get established. There's native grapes as well. If you're willing to eat the seeds or produce jellies with the fruit, native grapes are super vigorous and produce a lot of fruit and shade. And you can create shady areas with a trellis. But yeah, I think those are probably good starting points. I mean, I don't want to get lost in the plant world. There's so many options, and it really depends on your exact location and microclimate. You want to make sure your USDA zone is, matches what plants you're putting in the ground, and so that frost and heat, are taken into account.
And then we have another.
How do you get rid of grapes once established? Yeah, you basically, I don't know how thick the trunk is. If it's thick trunk, you might have to, get a Sawzall and expose the root ball and cut out as much as possible. They're very, very sturdy. So the sooner the better if you really don't want it. Might even be able to transplant it and give it away. Yeah, you might have to, yeah, just do some heavy labor, remove it, dig it out.
And then there's a question on what, is it a good idea to use fallen fruits as mulch?
Fallen fruits? I mean, I don't know what to say other than it's okay to leave fruit on the ground to rot if you don't have pest issues and you don't, sometimes what I do if like, say for the plums, I have issues with rats and Davis, so what I have to strategize harvesting with, shaking a tree once in a while. I use a kiddie pool, and my son and I just kind of go around harvesting as much as we can. And then the ones that I miss and they go on the ground, they get all disgusting. I go make it a point every few days to harvest those and feed them to my chickens or to put them in the compost bin. I have a soldier fly larva bin, and so I'm growing grubs for my chickens when in the summer. Fruit like citrus, you can just throw the peels back under the tree. Nature had it designed that way for the nutrients to just go right back to the tree. So I wouldn't stress about leaving fruit. The big thing is you don't want to grow a messy fruit over like a patio or a driveway or sidewalk. So just kind of consider relative location if you're planting like a mulberry or a fig, or something that will bruise when it falls. I did mention pineapple guavas is a hardy kind of evergreen shrub / tree, small tree, and it has edible flowers, and it also is very drought tolerant. Once it's established, you don't need to water it as much, and maybe once a month, once every 2 weeks if you want to produce a lot of fruit. And my point with pineapple guavas, and this related to this topic, is that it's a type of fruit that can fall on the ground and actually is still edible because it has a tough skin. So some fruits you can actually harvest off the ground, just wash them because they don't bruise easily. But other fruits, like figs, once it falls on the ground, stuff gets to it, and you gotta just use it or you can cover it with mulch. If you don't want to get fruit flies and stuff, you can just, cover with leaves from comfrey or other things you have around. Mulch on top of the fruit.
So Derek, we have more questions, but we're going to end up having Derek write a kind of a Q&A blog for the ones that we didn't get a chance to get to. But we do, I know it's 7:30 now, but you passed over the soldier fly bin, and there's some, like, you said it so quickly, and I'm like, well, what is that? So there's interest in the chat, like what, grubs for your chickens? And so.
Yeah, that's a whole nother topic of like, you can get excited about growing your own protein for your chickens, or if you're really brave, for yourself, just read about it, insect protein. But I have this commercial bin called a biopod, and the biopod is like, you can think of it as like a, like a 2 by 1 foot plastic bin, but it's specially designed to put food waste in any type. It's very forgiving, unlike other compost methods. And it has a ramp inside that when these grubs get to a certain size, they naturally want to kind of crawl up. They crawl up this ramp, they fall into a collection chamber, and you feed them to your chickens. It can be almost a third of their diet. And it's extremely rich in calcium, the insects, and protein, and silica, and some other things. And so you even see them in pet food supply stores. If you're buying chicken food, you'll see they have bags of dried soldier fly larvae, and they advertise how amazing they are for their health. But you can easily grow them. And I'm waiting to attract them, because I don't buy the starting culture. I wait till I actually do the compost no-no, which is basically put food waste in there and leave the lid open for a little bit. It'll attract the fly naturally. The black fly doesn't bite, or it's not a nuisance as a fly because it doesn't eat as a fly in the fly stage. And I'm actually looking at, I can see it out my window near my chickens. It's a great tool for growing your own chicken food. So look up biopod or look up soldier fly larva, yeah, there's a fascinating field of research in it right now. I actually live next door to a researcher on that topic and using it for growing protein for fish and humans.
So for humans to eat the bugs?
Yeah, to turn it into a, you know,
that's
processed.
That's a little too hippie for me.
Yeah. Some of us dabble in the
cross the line for me.
Yeah. You can leave it for your chickens. The chickens will turn it into eggs. That's the beauty.
Better. That's better. And the one thing you talked about, the mulberry tree, I planted my mulberry tree in my chicken coop, and so all the fruit that comes down, they eat it. So it was a neat placement of that. But anyway, I think we are done at 7:30. So thank you so much, Derek, for doing this with us, and all our food forest keepers for being here, and everyone else that joined us. It was a great little discussion. So thank you all.
Yeah, I had fun. Thanks for your questions, and I look forward to sending you more info. And also, I just hope all your gardens are abundant and that you share with others, and enjoy the wildlife too.